Tacoma breathed rust, its streets clinging to your souls like old debts that won't go away. Ethan Cole stepped into Sean Keller's bar, and the air, thick with whiskey and smoke, hit him in the face like a fist. The floorboards creaked under his weight, and every look in the place was sharp as a blade, sliding down your spine. He hadn't been here in 10 years, but the city remembered him, and it didn't forgive him. Ethan sank into a chair at the counter, his fingers instinctively brushing. The scar on his wrist, a reminder of the day Lucas Riley, his best friend, had been left lying in the dust of Afghanistan. The operation had gone wrong, and the bullet that was supposed to take Ethan had taken Lucas. The guilt had lived in him ever since, like rust eating away at his bones. Sean Keller, the former commander and now the owner of this dump, was wiping a glass as if he were erasing someone's past. His eyes, clouded with whiskey and age, settled on Ethan. "Back, huh?" His voice was low, like the rumble of an engine about to stall. Ethan nodded, not elaborating. He wasn't looking for conversation, he was looking for peace. And Tacoma wasn't. The kind of place that gave that away for free. The conversation was interrupted by the TV above the bar. The local news, muted but insistent, was reporting on a body found in an alley. A veteran of their unit, stabbed to death. The camera briefly showed the body, and Ethan froze. A cross was carved into the victim's chest. The same one tattooed on Lucas's shoulder. His fingers tightened around the glass, and whiskey splashed onto his hand. Sean noticed the look, but only chuckled. "Stay out of it, Cole. This isn't your war." Ethan said nothing, but something inside him clicked like the bolt of an old pistol. Lucas had been dead for 10 years, but his shadow still fell over this city. He finished his whiskey, dropped the bill on the bar, and walked out. The street greeted him with the smell of wet asphalt and the distant wail of sirens. The Tacoma was awake, crouched like an animal about to spring. The motel on the outskirts of town was as tired as Ethan himself. The lamp over the bed flickered, casting shadows that seemed alive. He dropped his bag on the floor and pulled out Lucas's old army jacket, the only thing left of his friend. The paper in the pocket crackled. Ethan unfolded it. A yellowed sheet of paper covered in Lucas's handwriting. A few words, disjointed as gibberish. "Don't trust anyone. They know." He frowned, trying to remember when Lucas might have written that. But the memory was like broken glass. Sharp edges, but no whole pieces. Sleep would not come. Ethan lay down, but the shadows on the ceiling moved, as if someone was standing behind the door. He stood up, checked the lock. All was quiet. Too quiet. He went to the window, pulled back the curtain. The street was empty, but the light from the lantern wavered, as if from someone's step. Ethan froze. His hand lay on the old knife hidden in his boot. The silence rang like a taut string. In the morning, he found the note. It was under the door, folded neatly, like a letter from hell. The ink smelled damp. The words were simple. "You're next." Ethan clutched the paper, his gaze falling on Lucas's jacket, still lying on the chair. The cross, the murder, the note. None of it was an accident. It was a challenge. And Tacoma, this city of rusty bones, was already sucking him into its maw. He pocketed the note and walked out. The street was cold, but not the kind that chilled your skin. It was the cold of the past, the cold of a past that never died. Ethan knew that to find answers, he would have to dig where Lucas had left his secrets. And somewhere in the shadows of Tacoma, someone was already waiting for those secrets to become his tomb. Tacoma smelled of iron and oblivion, its streets scarred by those who had tried to escape. Ethan Cole sat in Emma Larson's cramped apartment, surrounded by stacks of papers and the smell of over-roasted coffee. The lamp over the desk hummed, casting shadows that shifted, as if someone were eavesdropping behind him. Emma, with her sharp cheekbones and eyes that cut deeper than knives, leafed through the files, her fingers moving quickly, like someone who knows time is an enemy. 3 casualties in a month, she said, not looking up. All veterans, all from your unit, and that cross on their bodies. It means something, Cole. You know what? Ethan was silent, his hand instinctively tightening on the note still in his pocket. You're next. The cross carved into the chest of the first man killed was an exact copy of the tattoo of Lucas Riley, his friend whose death 10 years ago had left a hole in him that could never be mended. He wanted to tell Emma that this wasn't his war, but the words were stuck in his throat. Lucas was dead, but his shadow moved across Tacoma, and Ethan could feel it breathing. Emma threw a photograph on the table, the body of a second veteran, found in a ditch, a cross on his chest, eyes as empty as broken windows. These aren't just murders, she continued. This is revenge for something that happened back there in Afghanistan. You were there. Tell us. Ethan looked away. Afghanistan wasn't a place. It was a feeling, a mixture of sand in his mouth and guilt burning inside. The mission that killed Lucas had been a failure. The intelligence had been wrong. The enemy knew their plans. Lucas had stayed behind to cover the retreat, and Ethan had survived. That was all he knew, or thought he knew. I'm not a cop, Larson, he finally managed to say. And I'm not a hero. Leave that to the police. She chuckled, the sound dry as a snapped twig. The police? They close cases faster than a bar in Tacoma. You're the only one who can connect this to Lucas Riley. Or do I have to get into this mess myself? Ethan stood, his footsteps hammering into the floorboards. He didn't want to dredge up the past, but the note in his pocket burned his skin, and the cross in the photographs stared back at him. Where are the archives? He asked, his voice heavy as the weight he'd carried for years. The archives room at the military base outside Tacoma was dank, smelling of mold and old secrets. The shelves sagged under the weight of files, and dust settled on his fingers like ash. Ethan dug through the papers until he came across a mission report. Lucas Riley, his partner, the man he shared cigarettes and laughter with, was hiding parts of his life. Pages were missing from his file, torn out as if someone had erased his existence. But one detail remained. Lucas had met someone the day before the mission. The name was erased, but the signature was Sean Keller. Ethan gritted his teeth. Sean, their commander, now the bartender, knew more than he was letting on. He slammed the folder shut, dust rising like a ghost. His thoughts were interrupted by the creak of the door. Emma walked in, her face paler than usual. You should see this, she said, holding out the phone. The news headline, another veteran dead, cross on his chest. Time of death an hour ago. Night fell on Tacoma like a coffin lid. Ethan parked outside his motel, but didn't get out of the car. The light from the street lamp flickered. The shadows on the pavement seemed alive. He pulled out the note, reread it. You're next. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. He reached into the glove compartment, pulled out an old knife, the one Lucas had given him before their last mission. The blade caught the light, flashing like a warning. When he got out, his car was no longer alone. The driver's side window was shattered, shards glittering on the seat like stars in the mud. On the steering wheel was a photograph of Lucas, laughing, his eyes cut out. Ethan froze, his breathing heavy as if the air had thickened. Someone was here, and they knew he was digging. He turned around, but the street was empty, only the distant crunch of tires breaking the silence. Ethan stuffed the photo into his pocket, next to the note. Lucas was dead, but his lie lived on, and Tacoma, this city of rusty veins, was ready to tell it, or bury Ethan with it. He knew the next step would lead him to Sean, and to a truth that might break him forever. The floorboards of Olivia Drake's house groaned like living things beneath Ethan Cole's boots, each creak an accusation. The air was thick, saturated with the smell of damp and something sweet, almost rotting, that clung to the skin. Olivia stood by the window, her silhouette cut out of paper in the dim candlelight, fragile but sharp as a blade. She didn't turn. When Ethan entered, only turned her head slightly, her eyes cold as a dead lake, sliding over him. "You came for Lucas Riley," she said, her voice low and slightly husky, as if the words were being pulled from deep within. "But he's not here. He never was." Ethan clenched his fists, feeling the note in his pocket. "You're next," burning harder than ever. Olivia Drake, whose name had flashed through Lucas's army records, was the thread that led to the truth, or the abyss. He stepped closer. A floorboard squealed, and the candle shook, casting shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts. "You knew him," he said, his voice firm but something inside him cracking like old ice. "Before that operation. What was he hiding?" Olivia smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only cold calculation. "Lucas was a shadow, Cole. He didn't serve. He played, and you were his shield." She turned, her fingers sliding across the table where a stack of yellowed letters lay. "You want the truth? It won't set you free. It will break you." Ethan started to answer, but the phone in his pocket vibrated. Emma Larson. He picked it up, and her voice, sharp as a blow, broke into the silence. "Another one, Ethan, a veteran, just found. You need to see it." The crime scene was 2 miles from Olivia's house, in a deserted alley, where the streetlights had long since burned out, and the walls held the smell of urine and despair. Emma stood at the cordon, her face pale, but her eyes ablaze. The body lay under a tarp, but Ethan already knew what was there, a cross carved into the chest, like the mark Lucas had left for the world. He leaned down, ignoring the cop's gaze, and spotted something in the dirt, a medal, just like Lucas's, with an eagle etched into it. His fingers trembled as he picked it up, the metal cold as a lie. "It's his," he said, not looking at Emma. "Lucas's," she nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I checked the records. Lucas was seeing someone before that operation. Not Olivia. Sean Keller and—" She hesitated. "Someone was following me today. I saw a shadow outside my house." Ethan felt the air thicken, like someone was squeezing his lungs. Sean, his old commanding officer, whose name had come up in the report. The man who had stared at him like he was a ghost at the bar, and now Emma, in the crosshairs. He slipped the medal into his pocket, next to the photo of Lucas with his eyes cut out. The killer was close, and he wasn't just out for revenge. He was telling a story, and Ethan was part of it. Night fell like a heavy blanket on Tacoma, But sleep was a luxury Ethan didn't deserve. He sat in the motel, staring at the medal on the table. Its edges were worn, as if it had been worn for years, but the engraving was clear. Lucas had never taken the medal off. So how did it end up in the dirt next to a dead veteran? And what did Olivia mean when she said Lucas was acting? He pulled out the letters he'd swiped from Olivia's house while her back was turned. Yellowed, the ink faded. They were signed only with initials, L.R. Lucas Riley. One letter stood out. If they find out, we're all dead. Keep Keller on a tight leash. Ethan reread the line, his fingers tightening around the paper. Sean Keller. The man who knew more than he was letting on. The man who might have sold Lucas out. A creak behind the door made him freeze. He stuffed the letters in his pocket, grabbed his knife. The door was locked, but the shadow beneath it moved slowly, as if someone was checking. Ethan stepped closer, his breathing quieter, but his heart pounding like a hammer. The shadow disappeared, but on the floor beneath the door lay a new piece of paper. He picked it up, his fingers shaking. One word, written in a familiar hand. Closer. Tacoma was awake. She looked at him with the eyes of a killer, and Ethan knew that the next step would lead him to the truth or to the grave. He gripped the knife, feeling Lucas's shadow growing heavier with each passing second. The lie he called friendship was already beginning to choke him. The light from the lantern cut through the darkness, but the shadows moved faster, as if they knew their time had come. Ethan Cole stood at the entrance to the old military warehouse, his breath mingling with the wind that howled through the rusty gates. Emma Larson, beside him, clutched the lantern, her face pale but her eyes bright, like those of someone who had stared too long into the abyss. They had come here for the truth, for what Lucas Riley, his dead friend, had taken to the grave. But Ethan sensed that the truth did not save here. It broke. Inside, the warehouse smelled of oil and metal, the floor littered with shards of glass that crunched underfoot. Emma shone the light on the shelves, piled high with boxes covered in dust like a shroud. "The papers should be here," she whispered. "If Lucas wasn't who he said he was, this will prove it." Ethan nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. On Olivia Drake's letters, on the words, "Keep Keller on a short leash," on Lucas's medal, found in the dirt next to the dead veteran. He ripped the lid off the nearest box, and the papers fell to the floor, yellowed and smelling of old secrets. His fingers paused on the report. The mission in Afghanistan, the failure that had claimed Lucas. But below, in smaller print, was what he hadn't expected. Lucas Riley, codename Storm, was leaking information to the enemy. His death had not been an accident. It had been a price. Emma, standing at another shelf, gasped. "Ethan, look." She was holding up a photograph. Lucas and Sean Keller, their former commanding officer, at some camp. On the back was a date, a month before the operation, and the caption, "Keep him in the game." Ethan gritted his teeth. Sean knew. All these years he'd known. The creak of the gate made them freeze. The beam of the flashlight darted toward the entrance, but the darkness swallowed the light. Footsteps, heavy, confident, were approaching. Ethan grabbed Emma's hand, pulled her toward the shelf. "Quiet," he hissed. The figure entered, a tall silhouette in a long coat. The hood hid its face, but metal gleamed in its hand. A knife. Ethan recognized it. The veteran killer. The one who had left the note. "You're next." Emma pressed herself against the bookcase, her breathing ragged. Ethan pulled out his knife, the one Lucas had given him before he died. The shadow moved closer, its steps slowing, as if the killer could sense their fear. Ethan lunged forward, his blade cutting into the figure's arm. A scream tore through the silence, the knife falling, but the killer was faster, a blow to the chest that threw Ethan against the wall. Emma lunged for the exit, but the figure grabbed her by the hair. Ethan gasping through the knife, the blade sank into the killer's shoulder, and with a snarl, he released Emma, disappearing into the shadows. They ran outside, the gate slamming behind them like a coffin. Emma was shaking, but her voice was firm. He left this. She held a scrap of paper in her hand, coded and stained with dirt. Ethan took it, feeling the cold tighten in his heart. They got back into the car, and as Emma drove, he stared at the code. The clock was ticking. The killer was wounded but alive, and he knew where to find them. By morning, Emma had deciphered the letter in her apartment, her fingers flying across the keyboard, her face gray with exhaustion. "It points to Sean Keller," she said, her voice shaking. "He was Lucas's contact. They were both working for someone else." Ethan stared at the screen as a name flashed. Sean Keller, code name Lantern. His former commanding officer, the man who had looked at him in the bar like a shadow of his past, had been part of Lucas's betrayal. Ethan clenched his fists, feeling the truth he sought begin to choke him. Lucas was not a friend. He was a player, and Ethan was his pawn. He stood up, his steps heavy, as if the floor beneath him were creaking. "Where's Sean?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Emma looked at him, her eyes full of worry. "At the bar. But, Ethan, he's not alone. The killer knows we're close." Ethan nodded, his hand going to the hilt of the knife in his pocket. Lucas was dead, but his lie lived on, and it was leading Ethan to Sean and whoever was pulling the strings. Tacoma, that city of rusty veins, was holding him back, and he knew the next step would be the truth or the end. The mirror behind the bar reflected Ethan Cole's face, alien, eyes smoldering with the embers of guilt and rage. The dimness of the place was thick with the smell of spilled whiskey and old lies, and the neon sign above the door hummed like a death rattle. Sean Keller stood behind the bar, his hands moving slowly, polishing a glass, but his eyes were hard, as if he knew this would be his last conversation. Ethan stepped forward, the floorboards creaking, every sound an accusation. "You knew, Sean," Ethan said, his voice low but sharp, like a blade sliding across skin. "Lucas was a traitor, and you covered for him." Sean froze, his fingers tightening around the glass until it shattered. The shards clinked against the counter like coins tossed onto a grave. "You don't understand, Cole," he breathed. "Lucas wasn't just a soldier. He was the key. Without him, we'd all have burned up in Afghanistan." Ethan tossed the photograph onto the counter, the one he'd found in the warehouse, with Sean and Lucas standing shoulder to shoulder. "The key to what? Betrayal? The death of those you swore to protect?" His hand went to the knife in his pocket, but he didn't draw it. Yet, Sean looked away, his face as gray as ash. "Lucas was working both sides," he said quietly, "passing information to save us. But he got carried away, and someone up there decided he had to disappear." Ethan felt the floor beneath his feet shift, as if the truth he'd been searching for was crumbling. Lucas Riley, his friend, the man he'd shared laughter and cigarettes with, was not a hero. or a victim. He was a puppet in a game in which Ethan was merely a pawn. Who? He asked, his voice breaking. Who was pulling the strings? Sean opened his mouth, but the sound of footsteps at the entrance cut him off. The door swung open and a man in a long coat walked into the bar, his face in shadow. Ethan recognized him, the veteran killer, the one whose knife had left crosses on the bodies. His shoulder was bandaged, but his eyes were cold and determined. "You're too late, Cole," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "The truth is, here." An abandoned factory on the outskirts of Tacoma was the scene of their finale. The killer lured Ethan there with a note in the bar. "End the game, or it will end you." Emma Larson stayed in the car, her fingers clutching her phone, ready to call the police. But Ethan knew this was his fight. The factory smelled of rust and machine oil, its walls echoing with voices long dead. The killer stood at an old machine, his knife lying on the metal table like an invitation. "You were blind, Cole," he said, removing his hood. The face was familiar. Daniel Ward, their former comrade, the man Ethan had thought dead. "Lucas sold us out. Me, you, everyone. He used you to cover his tracks, and I'm just cleaning up his mess." Ethan clenched his fists, feeling. Ward's words cut deeper than any knife. Lucas wasn't just a traitor. He was the architect of their pain, the man whose lies had cost their lives. "Why me?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking, but not with fear. "Why didn't you kill me right away?" Ward smiled, crooked as a cracked mirror. "Because you were his shadow, his shield. I wanted you to see who he was before you died." He grabbed the knife, stepped forward, but Ethan was ready. He ducked, grabbed a metal pipe from the floor, and swung. Ward went down, the knife clanging, on the concrete. Ethan pinned him to the ground, his fist hovering over Ward's face. "Who else?" he snarled. "Who was behind Lucas?" Ward croaked, his eyes dull. "You'll never find them. They're higher. Always have been." "Police." Sirens blared in the distance, and Ethan let go. Ward didn't resist as they led him away in handcuffs, but his words remained like poison in his veins. The next day, Ethan returned to Sean's bar. The bar was empty, the glass covered in dust. Sean was gone, but there was a note on the bar written in his own hand. "You'll never know the whole truth. Cole, take care of yourself." Ethan clutched the paper, feeling it crumble under his fingers, like everything he believed in. Lucas was not a friend, but a mask behind which hid a web of lies too big to break. He left Tacoma that night, his car rolling down the highway, Emma sitting beside him, staring out the window. She wanted to write a story, but Ethan knew the truth. They had found wasn't for the papers, it was for those who lived with it like a knife in their chest. Lucas was dead, Ward was in jail, but the shadows of those above him still breathed at his back. Ethan watched the road, and every turn whispered, "This isn't the end. This is just a pause in a game where he's already lost everything but himself."